previously on Supa-Saturday's DrawAlong.
That's why I love to draw, and I wanna create Supa-Saturday, 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 DrawAlong.
Now that's the second time I've done that. My mic was on mute. Now they're talking to myself as happy as Larry. So I'm going to have to repeat everything I just said. Welcome once again to Supa-Saturday's DrawAlong. And we've been putting in the shadows here to Spy Master. Over the last few weeks, as you saw from the introduction, we were constructing the walking figure of a man, but I decided to make a Spy Master. So this has been great fun so far. So I hope you've been trying to follow me as well in this, what we call DrawAlong. So you can see we're going to hear big on the screen. Now you have to excuse me. The reason why I'm there talking to myself is if you're with me from the United States, before I forget, happy Thanksgiving. Right, you're probably still reading from your turkey. I'm going to be on turkey duty in a few weeks' time with Christmas lunch. That's my specialty for the family. Every year I do the turkey. So happy Thanksgiving to all of you out there from America or anyone that celebrates Thanksgiving. And yes, the reason why I'm a bit of a muddle is that, see, in America at the moment, it's just gone 6 p.m., correct? But I'm coming to you from Singapore, and we are 13 hours behind you. Sorry, in front of you. So in fact, it's 7 a.m. here. So I've just woken up. So I'm not the freshest. I'm not the freshest, as you could say. But I'll do my best. Now, before we start our shading, I noticed a couple of things with my construction that I don't quite like. So let's switch off the shading, and let's look at our structure. First thing I don't like, upon looking back on it, this kneecap on his right leg, sorry, his left leg, that should be lower. Because there's a little bit of foreshortening going on with that leg, and that should not be up there. And that's going to affect our shading. So I'm going to come to my shading there, and I'm going to erase away those shadows there. Now that knee looks like it's more bent. You can see that, right? And the second thing that I'm not very keen on is this shoulder muscle here. There should be an accent here for this muscle coming over. So now we come to render, I will take that into account. Hold on, I think I've got one comment there, it looks like. Anything important? Yes, no audio. I've got it, sir. I got it, sir. That's the man in charge telling me that there was no audio. But I've made my excuses. It's 7 a.m. I've offered my defense, and I'm going to stick to it. So let's get to our spotting, right? So you can see the way I'm constructing is my basic pencils. My costume is separate, and my shading is going to be on a different layer. So if you're drawing traditionally, of course, you don't have that luxury. But the process, do your spotting at a separate time. So we've got a basic light source coming from above. So always try to imagine that light coming from above and where the shadows would fall. So I'm putting a large shadow here under the bicep. Now, we've had a discussion in the past about when you're rendering, try to keep your pencil strokes all in one direction. Because then, you know, we live in a day and age where buying original comic art is quite a thing. So you want your work to be as nice as possible, presented as nice as possible. And the tighter your pencils, you know, if you're fortunate enough to have someone that wants your original work, the nicer your pencils look, the more they're going to the more likely they are to pay for it. So the light source is coming from above. Now, of course, for you out there drawing traditionally, this is one of the advantages of traditional over digital. Now, of course, someone might pay money for your digital pencils, a print of the digital pencils, but digital pencils have still not got the presence of an original piece of paper and the raw pencils on that paper. And I run a comic art class every Saturday morning here in Singapore via Zoom with students I have some students from India and around. And often parents would ask me, Jerome, what's best, traditional or digital? And I say to them, you can't really ignore either. In one sense, if you can't draw digitally, it's very, very hard to work professionally. Because, you know, publishers deal with deadlines. And without a doubt, drawing something digitally is more convenient. It is easier to change, to amend. But then you come to the question, as I just mentioned, of original artwork. And, you know, when you go to a Comic Con, for example, let's say if you're fortunate enough to be part of a production, and people, you know, you've got a bit of a following. Some people turn up and they want to commission you for a sketch. But if you can't draw traditionally, you're going to lose out on a lot of potential fans and money, I dare say. So I always say to parents, ideally, you would like your child, to have some understanding of both. Of course, with digital, you can make some mistakes and just Control Z or if you're using an Apple, Command Z, and all your troubles have gone. Traditionally, you don't have that luxury. So, you got to keep your practice up. I do a lot of work digitally, but I always make it a habit to try to sketch something traditionally whenever I get the chance. Not as often as I should, though. I'm a naughty boy. I do not keep up the level of practice that I should. So again, we're putting these blacks, we're spotting, and we're constantly taking into account the light source. Now, another artist asked me the other day, where do I know, or how can I know where the shadows fall? Now, that comes with experience to some degree. But most importantly, the number one thing in drawing is shapes. So we got some contours here. It tells us where the muscles are. Now, of course, I'm a superhero guy. So my characters are all very buff, all right? So we got basic contours here of muscles going on. And if the light source is coming from above, there's only a certain place where the light could possibly seep in, or the shadows will prevail. Now, it's true, when you're drawing, sometimes you have to take creative license to put shadows where perhaps, scientifically speaking, there wouldn't be a shadow there. That's where you could say design comes into it. Sometimes you have to defy light to get an effect, but it's very dangerous by doing that. And all I can say is that the more experience you get, the better you will be at what is largely cheating. Right? You're putting shadows in places or shading when there may not necessarily be shading there in reality. And sometimes that comes down to a sense of design, if you like. But constantly keeping in mind where fundamental sinews would be. We're doing his abs here. And you'll notice as well, I'm not really using a lot of references. A lot of what I'm doing is from memory and style. And then what you'd call, I suppose, what would be broadly termed is that I'm a bit old school in that I'm not so concerned with photorealism, you could say. And what I mean by that is, if you look at a lot of the superhero comic artists from America of old, you'll find that a lot of them are known for their style. And the further back you go, I think it's fair to say, in general, a lot of comic artists' anatomies were less technically accurate, you could say. But what they did have was immense style. And just this morning on Art Attack, I was talking to some of the guys there about this kind of idea of style over absolute accuracy. And one of the modern day artists that I have a great respect for is a gentleman by the name of Rob Liefeld. Rob Liefeld was often accused, or is often accused, of not illustrating anatomies 100% technically correct, which might be true in certain places. But what Rob Liefeld always had, which I greatly respected, was he had a sense of style. You know, he inspired a lot of young people to pick a pencil up. And that's because he had something, what I call artistic genius. Because it is not easy to draw something which is not 100% technically correct, but it still feels good. That, in effect, is a strong aspect of art in general. Doing something that just provokes emotion in a certain way, that is the true essence of art. And Mr. Liefeld was very, very much in that vein of drawing. You know, he affected people's minds, which is, it's not the be all and end all of an artist, but it certainly makes a difference. You know, I still have those childhood memories of when I first saw comic art. My brother had these comics, and I can tell you now, my mind immediately went into a completely different world. You know, comic art is something that, when you meet a comic art geek, we've all got something in common, mate. When we first discovered superheroes and that kind of stuff, life was never the same ever again. And I've been kind of like obsessed by it ever since then. Of course, I got older, got married, have children, not exactly in the right place to make it as a comic artist. I come from a small town in England named Reading. Now, Reading is about, okay, I've got to remember that that you guys there in America, you're not metric, but you still deal with miles. Reading is about 40 miles from London. So if you wanted to do anything in comics and that kind of stuff, you know, you'd have to go to London. There's no internet in those days. You have to go to publishers and editors, etc., in London. And you know, I was all the way out in Reading, so not really much of a chance to pursue comic art, so to speak. I did show my work to one publisher in London, and I was quite young then, and not the best. And they gave me some great advice on how to improve. So I went the other route that a lot of would-be comic artists do. I went off into commercial art, graphic design. And indeed, because I do like comics and the written word, I could also do copywriting. So I became an art director and a creative director. I spent most of my life in advertising design, working in that area. So yeah, so you'll find that any of us that discovered comic art from a very young age, no matter where our professions or our careers take us, this never leaves us. Rarely does it ever leave us. You can go away from it, but it will always be kind of lurking somewhere within the soul. So I'm doing all of the dark parts of the costume first. The Spy Master is dark blue and yellow. That's his color scheme. And the blue parts, actually, he also has some elements of green, but the green is shaded pretty in a light manner. So his color scheme, you could say, looks a little bit like classic X-Men costume. Now, I always remind myself every week that I must zoom in, because when you guys are watching at home, it's much more interesting the closer I am to the action. Yeah, we've almost finished the dark blue spotting. I'm going to pull back and take a look at, in general, what we've got going on. Oh yes, sorry. The dial on his head. Oh man, I mentioned on the last session that in this comic, Iron Man, I think it's Iron Man 34, he blasts Iron Man with his head beam. And as a kid, when I saw Iron Man's armor, when I saw Tony Stark's armor melting, I was very depressed. It affected me at quite a deep level. I did not like seeing Iron Man's metal getting vaporized. There was Spy Master and also another character called the Controller. They used to melt Iron Man's armor, and through the eyes of a child, you can take that kind of stuff a bit harshly. And at this time, Iron Man was my favorite character. I mentioned last time here that I went through phases as a child when different characters were my favorite. Okay, let's see what we got. Okay, I think we can put a little bit more of an accent on that part of the dial there for the shading. Okay, so we've got most of our basic spotting in. I'm going to drop in a little bit more of a shadow here. Funny, the more you render something, sometimes the more carried away you get. So I have to be very careful when I start shading something, that by the end of it, I've got more heavy-handed. So I have to go back and check what I was doing earlier to make sure I'm at the same level of intensity. So there we have the spotting for the dark blue areas. Now let's look at some of the decor on his outfit. Now these dials on his costume, I'm going to make them slightly more bulbous. I'm going to make them a bit 3D if you like. So I'm going to adjust that there. Now I need to adjust these ones. I suppose you would see one going around the back, if that's the case. And would you see one over here? No, that will be gone behind already. So I'm going to put a bit of shading in these shapes to give them a bit of form. Same here. And then I indeed hope that at least a few of you at home are deciding to draw along with me on these sessions. Because of the nature of this stream, I can't ever come in here with something half finished. I've always got to start it from scratch. And that's the beauty of Supa-Saturday's DrawAlong. And I've got to be careful as well of not going too fast, because I don't want to race off and leave anyone behind. I'm putting in some basic shadows on the lighter parts of the costume here. Maybe a shadow under this shoulder muscle. I always forget the name of this muscle on the shoulder. The ones up here by the shoulder, I know are trapeziums, but for some reason, I can never remember the technical name of a shoulder muscle. Hit those books, boy. Hit those books. Now again, I'm going to go back to my costume there, and I'm going to make these little decorations a bit more bulbous. Taking a bit of creative license there. You don't want to overdo your creative license, but I think it's all right. All right in this instance. Now, as we come in from his traps, from his trapeziums, it's like a dip in the anatomy. So a lot of shadow falls into this area, plus a light source from above is going to throw the shadow of his head over much of this area. We're going to get our shadows under. Now, of course, if you're going to add color to your image, a lot of shadows can be addressed during the coloring process. And in fact, a lot of, as I said, I'm a bit old school. And a lot of modern comics, you'll see this significantly less hatching. What I'm doing here is very retro, all these black areas. A lot of the modern superhero comics depend almost entirely on the coloring to set the light and dark. Now you see that sometimes my computer stalls. Clip Studio Paint does a backup momentarily in the background, which can be a great help if you ever lose a file. There's that, and I'm also recording a time lapse, and that does take up a certain amount of memory. So we've got the trapeziums coming into the shoulder muscle. We'll put a shadow in here and there. Got a bit of a protruding line here on my costume layer. That's because, remember, we drew through the object. I'm going to put some accents in here on the chest area. Accentuate that collarbone. The collarbone is quite an extraordinary muscle, in fact. That area of the anatomy, as you study the human anatomy, you get to appreciate just how amazingly engineered we are as a species. Extraordinary. And the way things fit together. It definitely does seem to be some sort of higher intelligence involved in our design, which would be, I suppose, broadly referred to as God. But learning anatomy is in this. As I said, I don't really use a lot of references. But once you've drawn people enough, you get a good enough idea of where things are. And if you're really stuck, by all means, you can always draw out some images of human bodies. Let's put in some spotting on this head. His ears are totally covered. I'm going to exaggerate his expression. This is a major part of, you could say, comic art, where you see expressions through masks. That, of course, that is just not possible. Like, we can see Spy Master's mouth in his mask. Not really possible. You know, he would suffocate if it was that tight. But when it comes to comics, what is it you call? Creative license. That is the magic. Shadow on the underside. And so his mask is skin tight. I'm just going to make the outer eye a little bit thicker here. He's got like these eyebrow things, which in fact, yellow, they're not dark. So you've got to leave them blank. Yeah, put some accents around the chin. Just add a bit more shadow under that area there. There we spotted that fist over here. Now, this is where I become a real fanboy. Artist named Jim Starlin, one of my absolute favorites of all time. The way he would draw fingers, it's very much affected me. And I'm very guilty of drawing things that, when it comes to fingers, drawing sinews that I'd have to say is Starlin anatomy. Good. Now his belt is also made of metal. Now I'm going to accentuate these barbarous things with some more of those accents. And I was looking at the structure of my letter S. And yes, I was trying to get some foreshortening going. We can always appreciate that. But ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I overdid it. The shape of that S is just a little bit too extreme. So let's just fix that while we're here. The center section should have been higher. For that, I apologize. Please accept my deepest apologies. That's better. So we go back to our spotting layer, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a shadow around the S in a metallic kind of way. The original that I referenced that I got this costume from was very old school. They did put in less detail. So again, creative license here. I'm adding in an accent of metal shadow in the lower belt and as it goes up around his waist. Now you see it's going around his waist. This is what you call foreshortening. Very important. And when we first started today, I started with some corrections. Something else that I think needs to be corrected are his pouches. I was not paying attention when I drew these. Now that is way too small. I mentioned earlier a very inspiring young artist, or more recent artist, Rob Liefeld. He was a master of the pouch wear. And he would never do something like that. The pouches here should be definitely bigger than this. Now, if you're drawing traditionally, if you did, as I would always tell everyone, one of my catchphrases, try to make this show more enjoyable. So what do I always say?
Keep those pencils light.
Again?
Keep those pencils light.
You heard me. Keep those pencils light. So erasing and moving these pouches is going to be significantly less of a problem if you've been sketching and keeping your pencil light. Funny, I mentioned earlier that I teach young students, and so often I see them doing something that I used to do. You'll draw something and it doesn't quite look right, but you insist on going over it as if making it dark is going to correct the mistake. You do, of course, just end up with a very dark, bad drawing. This is something that, I don't know, a lot of young artists we just do this. We just did that. If you're out there and you can identify with this, let me know. A dark mistake. That's what you end up with. So the shorts are generally quite a light color. They're yellow. So I'm going to drop a shadow in under the belt and just in the lower shorts area as it goes under his body. There. Now I was quite old school in that I put his pants leg quite far down his leg. That's very Jack Kirby. Jack King Kirby. You could say the father of superheroes, of superhero art. He would draw these shorts that come quite low. So if we're being totally Jack Kirby here, we need to lower his pants leg to somewhere here. Okay, so again, hopefully you kept those pencils light. We're just going to adjust this part of the costume. I rarely draw my pants this deep. Good. So let's go back to our shading there. So you can see that's affecting my spotting here. That we're no longer for here. And that little bit on the inside there. Good. Pants outside, man. You know, I sometimes do workshops where people ask me, Jerry or Jerome, what makes a superhero? And there's roughly 3 or 4 things. First one, the absolute hallmark of a superhero, you would say, is, are his pants outside? Now that's deemed a bit retro now. So the next one is, does he have a cape? And of course, not all characters have capes. So then you move to the next one. Does he or she have a mask? And if they fail all of these, there's no cape, there's no mask, and there's no pants outside, that leaves one thing: tight clothing, spandex. If your character has any of those 4 things, you got a superhero. If your character has none of those 4 things, but it's still pretty much a powered up character, you've probably got an action hero, not a superhero. So he's got a gun in his pouch, and it's in the shadows. So I'm going to drop in the shadow here. I put a shadow in the back part of the pouch. Put the gun inside here. A little bit of light with seeping. I'm going to put a shadow under here. Now we're back to the pouch, and I'm going to exaggerate the thickness of the leather there, my costume there, and I'm going to put a lot of this underside here into darkness. I'm going to put a shadow under the flap. As we said, the light source is coming from above, and this fascia of the holster is facing downwards in effect, so it's not going to capture a lot of light. And with the decoration we've got here, we just put a simple accent on those ridges. Put a slight shadow under the fob. I'm going to drop in a shadow where the material folds. Now again, remember I mentioned earlier about creative license, or where we put dark areas? This is a little bit like that, what we're doing here. I'm going to put an accent under these pleats here. There, that just about covers his gun and holster. So now we come down to, oh yeah, sorry, his boots have a dark presence. His boots are green, but they're dark. Now the logo on his chest, should we put a texture in that? Okay, let's put a bit of a texture. The light's coming from above. So what we can have is, if we put a shadow on the bottom quadrant of each of the diamonds. Now, as we come up the pattern, I'm going to make those patterns slightly smaller. So here, you see they're quite big as you go down the bottom. But then as we come up into the light, I'm going to make them less intense. Again, creative license. When Don Heck did the original drawing, there wasn't such detail, but I dropped in a bit of that detail there to spice things up, so to speak. Just going to put a bit of a shadow under here. It's a costume going over the top. Let's put a bit more shadow here. So we made it. We spotted our spy master. So that's the first step in putting in the shadows, what we've done there. Next, we're going to look at now is hatching, right? You know, when you go from dark to light, what you're doing, you're creating a shadow. Okay, you're creating the illusion of form. That's all it is. So certain artists may stop at this level of detail. It's perfectly acceptable. You don't really have to put in hatching, shading. But some artists do. So let's have a look at how we can do that. Now, this is where I have to tell you about a very true story, how I never thought that my art style could change so much in later life. But I used to shade in a certain way that now I don't really do that. Now, I mentioned earlier that I may share with you other things that I do outside of these streams. Now, if I just come here quickly, I produce a title at the moment called Supercross for Thunder Zone Comics. Now, Thunder Zone has a Kickstarter coming up where my Supercross number 5 will be available. And also, if you back a certain number of the comics, you can get a copy of my book, How to Draw Characters from the Thunder Zone. Because over the last few years, I've been working as an art director for Thunder Zone. And in this book, I actually touch on a rendering, but it's in the other volume where I actually get to shading. But you see, this whole book is only going to deal with contours, right? You know, here's a page on how to draw a hand holding a gun. But here's a page on feet. We go right through this whole part 1 of the book, but we never get onto rendering and shading. That comes in a later chapter. And I didn't realize how important it was that you can share so much knowledge on drawing, but this whole rendering and shading thing is a completely separate subject. So I said to the publisher, the editor-in-chief, Dan Sen, that we can split this up into volumes. So you see here in volume 1, I don't even get to rendering. So here, with the Supa-Saturday's thing that we're doing at the moment, let me just close this. Whoops. Hold on, I've lost my canvas. Where's the canvas gone, boy? There it is. Oh, I see, sorry. These are picking up my view. So here, I'm going to put some shading in. And at the same time, I'm going to demonstrate to you how I may have shaded differently many years ago. And things have just changed. And we can actually address this Or we could do something called cross-hatching, where I can actually combine my old style with a new style on a separate layer. So let's go for the first round of hatching. I will call this hatching 1. Whoops, hold on. See a couple of comments here. Let's see if Oh, Christian, he's a regular here at the Madness Entertainment Group. He does the COU. That's another big draw along with him. What's up, Christian? Thanks for tuning in. Oh, thank you, sir. He says, looking good. Thank you very much, young sir. Yeah, he's one of the busiest artists here at Madness Entertainment Group. And I'm going to try to, he's got a stream later. And I'm going to try to get on there because it's Sunday here in Singapore. And quite often I have to visit the in-laws when Christian's Saturday evening stream is going on. Hang on, is it Saturday evening? Saturday night stream. So, you know, what's 10 p.m. for you guys? I think it's 10 p.m. it goes out. That's 10 a.m. here for me. And I may be off to visit the in-laws or something. But I think we did that last weekend. So if I'm still around, I'm going to be hopping on that stream with you guys later on. So, yeah, so speak of the devil, Christian is an artist who is very much in the vein of another great artist named Bart Sayers. In whereas they don't really do a lot of hatching, okay? They tend to stop more at this phase, the block spotting. So now, which is what I also do, but quite often, depending on my mood, I will go into a hatching phase. So there's 2 different kinds of hatching. I don't know the technical term for them, but one I call spikes, and the other one I call gradation. Oh, Jerry Hinds, what the hell is spikes and gradation, I hear you ask? Well, it's like this. Back in the good old days, I would draw my hatching coming out of the blacks. So for example, here, it's coming up into the light. I might come in here and I would do this. Okay? And coming up from here, it's coming up into the light. So I would bring that up into the light. Let me zoom in. Zoom in, boy. I would bring it up into the light in that way. Then in later years, different artists, I think Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, some of the newer breed of artists, wouldn't necessarily do spikes in that way. Okay, I'll call this layer hatching 2. Okay, if you're drawing along at home, just take a pause for a moment. Let me demonstrate this first so you can decide on what you actually want to do. So as opposed to that style, they might do something like this. They would come out of the black in horizontals. Here, you would get gradations coming up from the dark. They pretty much have the same effect, but it's a different way of treating light. Here, you might even get another gradation here. Now you can mix the two. See, if I stick them both on, it's just, okay, it's more detail, so it's going to take you longer to do it. So is it worth taking that long to draw an image? Some artists would say yes. There's a fantastic artist by the name of Finch. And Finch does what's called a lot of cross-hatching. This is cross-hatching. Okay? So my natural style of hatching now is more like this. It used to be like that, but Finch has always done both. Is it Finch? Yes, his inker was a guy named Bat. And Bat was such a fantastic inker that I would often forget who the penciler was. But yeah, David Finch, I think his name is. Right, so what we're going to do is, what I'm going to do here is, I'm going to go with the style that I've picked up more in recent years. And then we can maybe revisit if we want to crosshatch some of this as well. So you're going to get the gradations coming out from the black here. And okay, now this is something that I often do. Dark, light, dark. I'm trying to get a gradation under there that's going up into the light, but it's from a dark to a light to a dark. So you press, let up, press again. Press, release, press. Press, release, press. Did you get that? We'll do the dark areas first. So I'm going to bring some light into this area here. The bottom of the chest here. The light goes in there and the shadow comes up into the brightness. Now here, I'm going to take the gradations out of that blackness there. I'm going to do the same here. And trust me, ladies and gentlemen, this is still a bit of a shock to my system. There's an old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I think that's largely true to some extent, but not always. And it's still a bit of a shock to me that I now render like this. This isn't natural to me, but I do like the effect of it. You know, I like the way it looks. Let me zoom in on that. And after many years of drawing in one particular way, look, listen, I'm 61 years old. When you learn something in your 50s, it's more special than when you're young, you know. When you're young, you're busy soaking things in. You know, you can learn something new every day. As you get older, okay, I won't say that you think you know it all, but you've been there, you bought the t-shirt, so to speak. And it's very hard to change old habits. But when I discovered, would you call this the image style of rendering? I'm not really sure. But I never noticed this before image comics in the 90s. So, okay, I wasn't 60 years old in the 1990s. But I've only started rendering like this in recent years. You know, I was still doing my spikes up until less than 5 years ago, I'd say. And something else as well about this style is, dare I say it, it is faster. It is less work, you could say, to some degree. Maybe that's how it was devised, that the guys at Image were trying to find different ways of doing the same thing. Now here's a thick, thin, thick, thick, thin, thick. Okay, now what haven't I said? What haven't I said that I normally would say during my streams? Ladies and gentlemen, if you're working digitally,
Save!
one more time, that was a bit quiet. Will you please turn that up?
Save!
Save, ladies and gentlemen. Never forget the save. I've got some horror stories. As I mentioned, I worked in advertising and design for years, and we were using computers. And this is back when computers were even more unstable than they are now. And the amount of times you would hear cursing and extreme expletives in the studio because someone didn't save and the computer crashed. I just saw a comment here somewhere, I think. Okay, Christian says, yes, I find this to be much more of a productive way. Right, Christian, I think, is referring to the spotting. right? Not bothering with the hatching. Perfectly acceptable as a way of illustrating. As I said, Christian does it. Another great artist, Bart Sears, he does it. And I do like it. The comic that I currently have with Thunderzone Comics, Supercross, I did virtually no hatching in the whole series. And in fact, in that series, the only characters that have any blacks are the bad guys. The good guys have no hatching. It's all done with the coloring, the lighting. I'm going to bring a shadow out of this. Here, bring another gradation out of this forearm muscle. I'm going to bring some up from here. Now, I have to confess, I just remembered something. Back in the old days, the 1980s, back in the 1980s, there was an artist doing something like this, you know. I remember another comic great named John Byrne. I remember seeing his hatching. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I got a major revelation here. I remember John Byrne not spiking, but gradating. But this was back during the very late 70s, early 80s. And I stopped collecting comics around this time for over 10 years. So, what I reckon happened was, he came into the market and had a profound effect on all of the comic artists. So by the time I came back in the early 90s, I think some of the newer crop of artists, for example, people like Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee and Mark Silvestri, I reckon they took on board what he did. And that's how this hatching actually came into being. So I'm not sure if anyone watching or anyone out there has heard this ever documented. But I think John Byrne might be responsible for gradation, because he was doing something similar to this in the late 1970s, early 1980s. I remember it. I've never consciously thought about that before, actually talking to you now during this stream. Hold on, the camera's just backing up. So I'm going to put the gradations in the dark part of the mask, the cheek area. Go ahead and let me zoom in to make sure you guys can see at home. There, so we're taking gradation lines out of the blackness. Now we move to the legs. So the thigh muscle here, we're going to bring that up like this. I'm quite ashamed of myself, you know. Some of these muscles, I don't actually know the name of. I've never bothered to learn the name of the muscles on the thigh area. For some reason, I learned the ones for the arms. I'll have to make a special note to make sure I go away and do that. Right, I'm going to do a thick, thin gradation here. Now, drawing comics, something I often have to remind my young students, in fact, any young artist in general, that you mustn't forget that comics are commercial art, are forms of commercial art. By that I mean, they rely on deadlines. Now, no matter how much we love doing our drawing, the question of a deadline always comes into it. So doing things that take longer, you know, this is why different ways of rendering, I think, come into existence. It's a matter of convenience. At the same time, comics are what I call a perfect mergence of the worlds of art. What I mean by that is, I explain to my students that there are two different kinds of art. There's fine art and there's commercial art. Fine art is, you can also say, includes art for art's sake. When you draw something for no other reason than it looks good and it makes you feel good. It provokes emotion. When you do that kind of art, quite often, you might not have any money. You know the old term, a starving artist? It comes from that. Art for art's sake. You do what you like, and hopefully you touch other people and you can become very successful. But quite often, that isn't the case. You know, as with Van Gogh and so many great artists, they die before they become rich, or they would have made money. And I think the reason why comic art is so special is I think it actually amalgamates the two worlds. It's a balance. It's a balance of commercial art and fine art. This is why we can get so attached to it. And, you know, very passionate. It provokes that passion in us that you always find only really with fine art. But it's there in commercial comic art. When you see art in advertising and design, you know, where I come from, very rarely do people get super passionate about something because it's to sell a product. So people, generally speaking, are not that vested in it from a soul, but in context of their soul. I suppose that's what makes great, you know, old movie posters. They were, to some degree, that amalgamation of commercial art and fine art. Now you notice that I rotated my canvas here. I do see that as a bit naughty. Oh, Christian's shared his wisdom here again. What is Christian saying? When it was shrunk down, they noticed where the points were visible, and they decided to just feather the black edges and to speed up the process. Right. Yes, Christian going into some of the process there. Indeed, when you know, when the reason why artwork is also so big, you know, original comic art, the pages are close to twice as big as what you actually see on the printed page. You know, that is to compress the detail. Then, you know, it becomes sharper. Now, in Hong Kong, you know, I don't know if you've ever seen any of those marvelous Kung Fu comics. Now, in America, in the imperial size, I think your original comic board is like 10 inches, 11 inches, or sorry, I forget the original measurements for a comic art page in America. In the metric system, it's close to what we call A3. And by the time you reduce the image, it becomes very, very sharp. You know, that was also part of the reason behind why you draw things much bigger. And in Hong Kong, they take it to the extremes. If you see some of the original artwork, some of it's twice the size of an original American comic art page. But if you see the hatching that they produce, it is super, super, super fine. So they had to do that to get the effect that they wanted. Now, naturally speaking, I'm actually a hatching person, right? I did my Supercross with absolute solid blanks, mainly because I was writing, so I was plotting and doing a lot of that work while I was doing my normal job. And I simply didn't have enough time to hatch to the degree that I wanted to. And also, I wasn't inking it. I was using other inkers, and they varied in experience. And the last thing you want to hand an inexperienced inker is a load of hatching. So I made the executive decision to go with spotting only. But it's to each their own. Whatever you prefer to do, whatever looks nice to you, you go with that. And I happen to like a lot of the different styles. You know, I don't have a glaring preference. I prefer hatching, but not to the point that I have to do it all the time. Okay, we're pretty much here with our hatching. Now I'm going to put in some effects on the metal. I love to do that with the thick thin thing. And this is very Image Comics. I'm going to put some in here. Thick, thin, thick. Thick, thin, thick. And the way how I pencil and ink is the way I do it digitally is very similar to what I would do traditionally. I remember when someone told me I couldn't get my inking. I think I told this story before during the stream. I couldn't get my inking to look like my idols. And I don't like that boot. Hang on a second. That's terrible. Hang on, I'm changing my mind on this. I'm going to go in the other direction. I'm going to go vertical. Thick, thin, thick. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I'm too busy entertaining myself talking. I hope someone's out there listening. We've got a few viewers. We've got Christian for one. What was I saying? I've lost my train of thought. Can't remember what I was talking about. Could be that important then. Okay, good. And I put a little bit of hatching on this pouch. Bring it up into the light. Come into the light, boy. And how long we got left? Oh my goodness, 20 minutes left. Okay, we're gonna finish. We're gonna get our basic rendering finished. And I think next week we can maybe do some inking on this piece. We haven't done a lot of inking yet. Now my pencils here are quite tight. So the inking, you could say to some degree, speaks for itself. You know, if another inker had to ink this, it's pretty clear what's going on. Now this is a very metallic effect that I like with dots. I'm going to put a bit of a texture. I'm going to make this S to look a bit more metallic. Just a little bit of hatching on that belt. There. I think we're pretty much there with our rendering, are we? Yeah. I'll put just a bit of rendering on this glove. This is protruding in front of him, so it's very much in the light. On the shoulder here. This seems to have gone very fast. I'm not sure I'm not missing something. This rendering. Yes, you're forgetting the upper torso. Concentrate, boy. Whoops. My mouth is very near to my microphone. You noisy man. Okay, good. And just take a bit here. Now on the mask, above the eyes, I'm going to put in a bit of hatching here to get that expression accentuated a bit more. Back in the 1970s, there was a Filipino inker named Rudy Nebus, and he was absolutely brilliant. He would sometimes ink my favorite artist, a gentleman by the name of Gil Kane. Gil Kane is my favorite artist of all time. He just beats Neil Adams and Jim Starlin, for me personally. And when Rudy Nebus would ink Gil Kane, it was total perfection. Okay, so here, whoops, slow down, boy. You've not done the head. Now this one, I'm gonna go thick, thin, thick, thin. No, this one I cannot avoid. This is spiked. I'm gonna take it off into the light. Let's accentuate that expression a little bit more. You've got to be careful with faces that you don't put too much detail in. Easily done. Save. Save. Okay. So there we've got the gradation hatching. So I'm not saying that we have to do what we're going to do, but no, I'm going to mix this with spikes, which will give us cross hatching. So remember we did a bit here. So let's see where else would be nice for cross hatching. You can have some coming up here. Remember, you're dealing with shapes. A muscle is a ball. So, okay, if this is a ball, okay, you're gonna come, let's say if it's dark here and it's light here. The more you take things in this direction, there's lots of different hatching going up and up. You're going to start to get going in dark, going into light. So that's pretty much what you're doing. So cross hatching, if you're talking about reality, cross hatching is more realistic, you could say. Right? Now look at what I've done there. See that I started to demonstrate this part too. Hang on, right? Hang on. I just created a cardinal sin. Remember I just put this in? Hang on. Let me go back. Okay, there we are. I started hatching on the wrong layer. Naughty boy. Now hatching one is the spikes. Remember I showed you that this is what I used to do when I was younger. But hatching two is gradation. And I'm so busy talking, the absolute cardinal sin is doing something on the wrong layer. Right? So I've switched off my gradation there. So let's continue on the spiked layer with the gradation switched on. So you come up here. You would come up here. Now you don't have to do everything. It's the parts that you think are most poignant. Like I would put some in here. You don't have to cross-hatch everything. Again, why would you cross-hatch certain things and not other things? It's the intensity of the shadow. This comes from, well, basically understanding the light. the more you draw real things, the better understanding of life you will get. So this, this stomach muscle here, this ab, it's coming in from underneath. So here, I'm going to take my spike to hug the curve of that muscle. That's what I want there. Think of the curve of the muscle of the ab, and you bring the shadow into the light. Imagining it's a ball, like I just demonstrated. It's the underside. This is going in to the darkness. And the hair. Now, it's true, I've noticed that at Comic Cons, artists like Bat, they do pick up some very, very good paydays for their pencils, because they have a lot of this sort of stuff going on in traditional pencil. And it does look very, very nice. When you've got original pencils with this kind of detail, it can be quite breathtaking when you see it. Some of those guys are fantastic renderers. Really are. And I remember the first time I ever saw a page of original pencil artwork, I couldn't believe my eyes. Hang on, I forgot some gradation on this layer. Concentrate, boy. Here's the spikes. You take that behind there, and remember the shadow of the collarbone. There, and coming up into here. Now I'm going to put a little bit of cross-hatching here for the expression. Coming out of the cheekbone area. Cross-hatching, in fact, it can be likened quite a lot to very realistic illustration. Let me show you what I mean, in fact, right? During Supa-Saturdays, not Supa-Saturdays, Late Night Art Attack. Remember earlier, I said I was here? Right, sorry. Let me play quickly a recap of what happened on Late Night Art Attack earlier. Right, hold on there. Let me mute my music. Here's a recap of what happened during the stream earlier. And we'll have a quick discussion regarding hatching when you see this again. Hold on. I did upload it here because it's going to be an intro for next week. Okay, this was Late Night Art Attack. A brief recap of what we did earlier.
Previously on Late Night Art Attack.
Right, now what I mean by that is, here's the illustration that I did earlier. It was a tribute illustration to a gentleman named Jimmy Cliff. He was a reggae artist, one of my childhood favorites. And around the time in 1972, when he was big, especially with a song called The Harder They Come, this was a time that Luke Cage Power Man was becoming prominent. And they had very similar hairstyles. And with the shape of his face, he actually looked a lot like Luke Cage. So to pay tribute to Jimmy Cliff earlier in my comic book world, I made Jimmy Cliff Power Man, reggae's ultimate hero, 1944 to 2025. Now, when I was drawing this, can you see my pencil rendering is a lot of cross-hatching. And there's one inker from yesteryear named Vince Coletta. He was quite notorious in that he would often miss out pieces of detail for the late, great Jack Kirby. But Vince Coletta used to ink in a way that if I could resurrect him, I know that he would ink this image here very accurately. The cross-hatching is almost a bit like shading. And he understood this. I hazard a guess that Vince Coletta was himself a fine artist. I believe that from the way he used to ink. And what we're doing here, this cross-hatching is very much closer to if you were just penciling something as a traditional normal artist and not necessarily a comic book person. So when you look at artists, like I mentioned earlier, the guy called Finch. I think Finch is a fine artist in every sense of the word, or in every sense of the term. And Neil Adams, again, possibly often referred to as possibly one of the, it's controversial, but some people deem him to be the greatest superhero comic artist ever. And he first showed me cross-hatching back in the mid-1970s. And as a young child, or as a youngster learning how to draw, I remember thinking to myself, this looks very, very realistic. I'm not saying that realism is the be-all and end-all. Remember I said earlier about stylization. But there is something to be said for something being realistic. The challenge is, can you make something realistic, but also have an element of the escapism of a superhero comic artist? Ultimately, it's escapism. And I think some of the modern artists have the realism, but not the escapism. And that is a shame, you know, for me personally. But, you know, some of the younger comic enthusiasts, they might disagree with me, which is fine. You know, times have to change. Nothing ever stands still. How long have we got left? 7 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna have to wrap. I'm almost there, which is perfect, because I want to play a few trailers for some things that I'm involved in. Like I just showed you what happened on Late Night Art Attack earlier. And I'm involved with a Kickstarter. And we've also got a Fund My Comic. We've got a Fund My Comic campaign going on here that I'd like to run the trailer for before the end of the show. Right, here we are, cross-hatching. Yes. I do like me some cross-hatching. Deadlines don't always permit, but we're here. Supa-Saturday's DrawAlong, and I've got enough time that I can cross-hatch with you fine folk out there. So we're going to pull back in a minute and have a closer look, a macro look at what we're doing here. Now, remember I mentioned it's the shapes. It's the ball of this muscle here. We're hugging the shape of that. Got some comments here. Okay, let's have a look. William says, thank you for educating me. Oh, you're welcome, William. He says, Art Attack. Yeah, William's a regular. We need to see it again. Some of us, like me, showed up late. I missed them. Okay, I mean, I wonder what was that I might have shown. Yeah. Okay, the Fund My Comic, Goodbye to Romance. I just mentioned that. And I'm going to play the trailer for that before the end of the show. It's a tribute book to Ozzy Osbourne. And a lot of the artists here, the Madness Entertainment Group, we all gave our own submissions in tribute to the great man. And it's been compiled into an anthology, and it's currently on sale at fundmycomic.com. Some amazing artwork in there. You saw earlier, I was talking to Christian Zaffo. He's got some excellent pieces in there. My partner in crime at Late Night Art Attack, Raul, he's got a piece in there. Of course, yours truly, I have one in there as well. Okay, so I think we're pretty much there with our basic rendering. Let me get rid of my notes at the side here that says Spike's Gradation. We're going to ink this next week. So how long we got left? 4 minutes. Okay, so quick recap. We did hatching, which was gradation. This is a modern style of hatching. Just now, I did spikes, which is what I used to do more when I was younger. You see, spikes by itself can also stand up. Then we can mix the two to have cross hatching. So next week, we're going to ink this. I'll zoom in even tighter. Where did my spikes come back? I thought I just deleted that. Concentrate, boy. There, the face, kind of to the arms. I quite enjoy doing that torso. Remember, the light source is coming from above, all the way down to the feet. So next week, we'll be inking, and I'll be talking about pressure on the brush, whether it's digital or traditional. You know, trying to keep a consistency of line. That's what we'll be looking for. So thanks again for tuning in. I'm going to play a few trailers. I'm going to see you all back here. Let me try and get a bit more personal with you people. That's better. Yes, thanks once again for tuning in. I've got a broken chair here. It keeps sinking. Hang on. Got to buy a new chair. I get lower and lower as the show goes on. But yes, I'll be back here next week, same time. We'll be inking Spy Master. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Of course, please go to the Madness Entertainment Group Facebook page if you've got any questions. And I can send you copies of some of this work if you want to work on it at home, some of the guides, etc., etc. But yeah, I enjoy doing this. I'm going to play a few trailers. I'm going to see you back here again at the same time next week. Some words of encouragement to remember always, if you're working digitally,
Save!
And if you're working traditionally,
Keep those pencils light.
You heard me. Do as I say. I'll see you again next week. Here's a few trailers of some stuff we got going on here. Peace.
Ozzy, what are you doing? Come and have a look at this lovely book that was sent over.
You're wrapping in the perpendicular.
Oh, go on and spit the bat out your mouth. No one can understand you like that.
Say how 5 dentists and all.
Oh, well, that's not much better. Ozzy, why don't you sing to me? I can always understand you when you sing to me.
Fucking my brains. What is this my publisher sent me? Inked in black with art so sweet.
So what do you think? Do you like it?
Oh, Lord, yeah.
If you like stories about truth, honor, and justice, then you should check out MAGA Man. It is Donald Trump as many now see him, the defender of justice and a warrior for peace through strength. MAGA Man is an all-American style 22-page comic book, so get over to fundmycomic.com and support the culture of truth, honor, and justice. With MAGA Man, the most needed hero of all. MAGA Man.
Whether he's a boy
Thunderzone Comics returns. 5 all-new comics: Sumo Boy, Weirdo, Marshall Strong, Big House Blues, and Supercross, plus a free how to draw characters from the Thunderzone. When you back all 5 new releases, the Kickstarter pre-launch campaign is live now.
Thunderzone Comics! Supa-Saturdays. 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 DrawAlong. Supa-Saturdays. 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 DrawAlong. I love heroes, no matter their age and no matter their size. I wanna be a hero, that's why I love to draw and I wanna create. Supa-Saturdays. 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 DrawAlong.
If you missed the live viewing of any Madness Entertainment Group production, you can find all our content on Roku or as a member of this channel. We'll see you next time on the Madness Entertainment